The stagecoach hit the ravine lip at full gallop, and Violet Norris had exactly 3 seconds to understand that the world was about to end before it did. She had boarded the Butterfield Overland stage in Tucson on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1878, carrying one leather trunk, a reticule stuffed with $22, and a folded letter of employment, and the quietly desperate hope that Santa Fe would be kinder to her than Tucson had been. The letter promised her a position as a schoolteacher at a newly established schoolhouse outside of Santa Fe, a position arranged through a correspondence that had taken the better part of 4 months and had cost her more postage than she could comfortably afford. She was 24 years old, possessed of dark auburn hair that refused to stay pinned, a temper she had mostly learned to govern, and a stubbornness her late mother had called a character flaw, and her late father had called the family's finest inheritance. She had no one left who knew her well enough to call it either one anymore. The other passengers had been a portly merchant named DeVoe who smelled of pipe tobacco and talked without ceasing about cotton futures, and a quiet, sun-darkened woman named Mrs. Caldera, who was returning to her sister's home in Albuquerque. The driver was a weathered man named Cole, with a gray beard and the kind of eyes that had seen enough bad country to stop being surprised by any of it. The man riding shotgun beside him was younger and had not said a single word to any of them at the relay station. They were somewhere between nowhere and somewhere, the red canyon walls rising on either side and the late afternoon sun turning everything the color of a dying fire when it happened. Violet had been watching a hawk circle through the narrow strip of sky above the canyon when the wheel of the stagecoach found the edge of a washout that the spring rains had carved since anyone had last traveled this particular stretch of road, and the road gave way. The world tilted. The horses screamed. The merchant grabbed the door frame and missed. Mrs. Caldera's rosary beads went flying in a bright arc. Violet had one hand braced against the side wall, and when the coach rolled, she was thrown clear through the open window rather than crushed within it, which was either the luckiest thing that had ever happened to her or the second worst thing, depending on how one chose to measure luck. She hit the earth on her left side, rolled twice through a clump of dry sage, and came to rest against a boulder at the edge of the road, staring up at the sky while the world rang like a struck bell inside her skull. For a long moment she simply lay there, cataloging her parts. Her left shoulder burned with a pain that was insistent and sharp, but not, she thought, the particular agony of a broken bone. Her palms were scraped raw. There was blood on her temple from something, a cut she couldn't quite locate, and the whole left side of her face felt as though someone had used it to sand a rough plank. The hawk was still circling above the canyon. She found that oddly steadying. The sounds that followed were not pleasant. The horses, 2 of them tangled badly in the traces, were making sounds she wished she could unhear. She pushed herself upright, and the world swam for a moment, and then she turned to look at what remained of the stagecoach. It had gone down the shallow ravine and come to rest against a cluster of boulders some 20 feet below the road, broken apart at the front axle, one wheel still spinning slowly in the late afternoon air. Cole the driver was down there, motionless, half under the front section of the coach. The man who had been riding shotgun was nowhere she could see. Mrs. Caldera was sitting on a rock a little way down the slope, clutching her rosary and appearing dazed but upright. The merchant DeVoe was not visible. Violet got to her feet, and the pain in her shoulder made her hiss through her teeth, and she made her way down the slope on unsteady legs. She found DeVoe behind a boulder, shaken and bleeding from his nose but awake and already furious about it, which she took as a reasonable sign that he would survive the afternoon. Mrs. Caldera, when Violet reached her and took her hands, had a gash on her arm that had bled freely down her sleeve but was already slowing. Cole was the problem. Cole was unconscious, and his left leg was bent in a direction that human legs were not designed to go, and Violet could do nothing for the horses at all, which was a grief she set aside in a practical corner of her heart, where she stored the things she could not change. She tried to remember how far they were from the last relay station. 4 miles, she thought, perhaps 5. The driver had mentioned the next relay station as being roughly 6 miles ahead when they had last stopped, and they had been traveling perhaps 40 minutes since then at a reasonable pace. She did the arithmetic and arrived at an answer she did not find encouraging. 3 miles from the station they had left, possibly more. 3 miles from the station ahead, possibly more. The sun was declining. There was no water in sight. She had no canteen, having left hers in the leather trunk which was somewhere in the wreckage, and the canyon walls rose on either side and offered precisely nothing in the way of comfort. She tried not to think about what lived in the desert at night, what made those sounds in the dark, what had been reported at the last relay station in the half-heard conversation she had not meant to listen to between Cole and the station keeper about raiding parties and unsettled territory. She had told herself it was distant, that it didn't concern her route. She had been perhaps somewhat too confident in that assessment. The only sensible thing to do, she decided, was to get the passengers to whatever safety was available and then go for help. She could not carry Cole. She could not move Cole without risking making his injuries worse. She organized the other two as best she could, made a shade of sorts with a section of canvas from the coach's boot, left them with the one canteen she had found in the wreckage, and was in the process of calculating whether to go ahead or behind when she heard the horse. A single horse, moving at a steady walk, coming from the direction of the ahead rather than behind, which was the luckier of the two directions given everything. She climbed back up to the road and stood in the middle of it with her ruined hair and her bloodied temple and her torn traveling dress, and she waved her arms. The horse stopped. The man on the horse did not move immediately. He sat there on a big roan gelding, and he looked at her, and he looked at the fresh scar of disturbed earth at the road's edge, and he looked at the wreckage below, and then he swung down from the saddle in a single fluid motion that spoke of someone who had been getting on and off horses since before he could remember. He was, she thought, somewhere in his late 20s or early 30s, with the kind of face the territory had shaped rather than simply given to him, tanned dark by sun, angular at the jaw, with light gray eyes that were sharp and careful and not unkind. He wore a worn canvas coat and a battered hat, and there was a rifle in the scabbard on his saddle, and a pistol on his hip that he hadn't gone for, which she noted with some relief. His boots were dusty, and so were his trousers, and so was everything about him, and he had the particular stillness of a man who spent a great deal of time alone and had learned to read a situation before he spoke into it. He looked at her for a moment with those gray eyes and said, "How bad is it?" "Bad enough," she said. "The driver is unconscious with a broken leg, 2 other passengers both walking wounded, the horses—" She paused. "The horses are beyond help." He nodded, one short decisive motion. "Can they be moved?" "One of them, yes. The driver, I don't know, I'm afraid of his spine." He was already moving toward the slope's edge, looking down at the wreckage with the same careful reading of situation look, and she found herself following him without quite deciding to. He went down the slope more carefully than she had, testing each foothold, and crouched beside Cole and put 2 fingers at the man's throat for a long moment. "Alive," he said, breathing steady enough. He ran his hands along Cole's back and neck with a practiced sureness that surprised her. "I don't think it's his spine," he said. "His head took a knock. The leg is broken clean, bad break, but clean. We can move him if we're careful." "You know something about injuries," she said. "I was with the army for 3 years," he said without looking up. "You learn." She did not ask which army, or what years, or where, because there was a particular way he said it that closed the subject as efficiently as a door. Between them, they improvised a litter from the canvas she had already pulled, and 2 of the longer pieces of the coach's broken side rail, and they got Cole up the slope over the course of an agonizing 20 minutes during which Cole remained blessedly unconscious. DeVoe, despite his bloody nose and his grievances, proved useful when it counted. Mrs. Caldera held the roan gelding's bridle and murmured softly to the animal in Spanish. When Cole was settled at the roadside, the man straightened and pushed his hat back from his forehead and looked at the sky with the practiced eye of someone reading a clock in the color of the light. "Relay station's 2 miles and a bit ahead," he said. "My place is a quarter-mile off the road. Closer." She looked at him. "Your place?" "Homestead. I'm not the relay station and I'm not a hotel. But I've got a roof and water and a fire, and I can ride for the station from there. Get them to send their wagon for your driver." He looked at her with those measured gray eyes. "You're bleeding." She had forgotten about the cut on her temple, which had been doing its steady work while she attended to everyone else. She lifted her fingers to it and they came away red. "It's minor," she said. "It needs to be cleaned," he said. He did not say it as though she were helpless. He said it as a statement of simple fact, the same way he had said everything else. "I'm Violet Norris," she said. She did not know exactly why she said it at that moment, except that it seemed important to be a named person rather than a category of disaster. He looked at her for a moment longer, and something in his expression shifted slightly, a subtle easing of something that had been held tight. "Levi Bishop," he said. That was how it began. Not with a dance or a parlor or a proper introduction in a proper setting, but with blood on her temple and the smell of sage and dust in the air, and a stagecoach in pieces down a ravine, and the two of them standing on a road 3 miles from anywhere in the late afternoon light of the Arizona territory. His homestead was, as he had said, a quarter-mile off the road, down a track that was barely more than parallel ruts in the red soil, past a low ridge of rock that blocked it from view of the road entirely. It was a modest spread of house of adobe and timber, a barn that was newer than the house, a corral with 3 horses in it, a small kitchen garden that someone was tending with some diligence, and a water pump that was the most beautiful thing Violet had seen in several hours. The whole of it was neat in a solitary, spare way, the way a man's place is neat when he has organized it entirely to suit himself and no one else. He helped DeVoe and Mrs. Caldera down from his horse. DeVoe rode and Mrs. Caldera walked beside, which was the only arrangement that made mathematical sense given the numbers, and he settled them inside with water and a steadiness that was clearly second nature to him, and then he came back to where Violet was standing at the pump, washing the blood from her face with cupped handfuls of cold water. "Let me see it," he said. She turned to face him, her wet hands at her sides. He leaned in to look at her temple with a closeness that was entirely clinical and not at all comfortable for reasons she did not immediately examine. The cut was not long, perhaps an inch, but it was deep enough to need attention. "Sit down," he said, nodding at the low bench beside the door. She sat. He went inside and came back with clean cloth and a bottle of something that smelled strongly of alcohol and did not come from a pharmacy. She looked at it skeptically. "Whiskey," he said. "It works." "I'm sure it works wonderfully for you," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was adjacent to one. "Brace yourself," he said, and pressed the cloth to the cut. And she did not flinch, which seemed to register with him the same way the cut had registered, as a fact that was noted and filed without comment. He worked efficiently and cleanly, and his hands were steady, and she watched his face while he worked because she had nothing else to look at from that angle. He was not handsome in any conventional or easy way, but there was a quality to his face that she found increasingly difficult to dismiss, something honest and direct in the architecture of it that she was not accustomed to. "How long have you been out here?" she asked. "4 years," he said. "Alone?" He tied off the bandage with a neat knot and sat back on his heels. "Mostly," he said. She did not pursue it. She looked out at the yard, at the careful kitchen garden, at the mountains that were turning purple in the distance. "It's very quiet," she said. "Yes," he said, as though that were not a hardship, or at least as though he had made his peace with it being one. He rode to the relay station while it was still light enough, leaving them with the house and the fire and a pot of bean stew that had been sitting at the back of the stove, and was better than anything Violet had eaten in 3 days of stagecoach travel. Mrs. Caldera fell asleep in the chair by the fire almost immediately. DeVoe complained about the stew's seasoning and then ate 3 bowls of it and complained about that too, which Violet found she had neither the energy nor the inclination to respond to. She sat by the fire and looked at the room. It was a simple room. A table, 2 chairs, a shelf of books. This surprised her, and she leaned forward to read the spines in the firelight, some tools hanging on the wall in tidy order, a coil of rope, a good kerosene lamp. The shelf held 3 books on what appeared to be natural history, a battered copy of something by Washington Irving, a Bible that was worn at the spine, and what appeared to be a surveying manual. A man who read and thought then. She filed this alongside the other facts she was accumulating without quite deciding to. He was back within 2 hours, and the relay station's man came with him driving a light wagon, and coal was loaded into it with care and taken ahead to the station where a relay rider would go for the doctor at Selden Wells. He arranged all of this with a quiet efficiency that was starting to feel to Violet like a kind of music, reliable and steady, no notes wasted. It was late by then, and the question of the night had to be addressed practically. The relay station was 2 miles ahead and could accommodate the merchant and Mrs. Caldera in the wagon. Violet's trunk was still in the wreckage and contained everything she owned. She said this plainly without self-pity, because self-pity was a luxury she had not been able to afford in some time. "The station man can get your trunk in the morning when he goes back for another look," Levi said. "It'll keep one night." "And I suppose I should go with them to the station," she said. He looked at her, and there was something careful in the look, as though he were choosing his words with a deliberateness that was itself interesting. "You could," he said, "or you could take the second room. It's nothing special, but it's a room." She thought about the relay station, which would be full of the noise of other travelers and the smell of horses and the sound of DeVoe continuing his complaints. She thought about the quiet of this room and the fire and the bookshelf. "I'll take the room," she said. He nodded as though this were simply practical, and it was, and it also was not quite only that, and both of them understood this and neither of them said it. The second room was small and had a narrow bed with a wool blanket and a hook on the door, and a window that looked out at the dark mountains. It had the clean smell of wood and dust that the whole house had. It was the first time in a week that Violet had had a room to herself, and she sat on the edge of the narrow bed and looked at the mountains in the dark and listened to the quiet, which was immense and entirely different from the quiet of a city or a town or anywhere with other people near enough to hear. It was the quiet of something older than any of that. She slept better than she had in weeks, which surprised her enough in the morning that she lay still for several minutes just considering it. She woke to the smell of coffee, which was a more powerful enticement than any clock. The sun was only just coming over the ridge, throwing long gold light through the window, and the kitchen was already occupied when she came through in her only remaining dress. The one she was wearing, the rest being in the trunk, which was torn at the hem and stained with red Arizona dirt, and had a cut she could not repair without her sewing kit, which was in the trunk. He was at the stove, and he looked up when she came in, and there was a moment that was not uncomfortable but was aware, 2 people taking measure of each other in morning light, which is a more revealing light than most. "Coffee," he said, and poured her a cup. She wrapped both hands around it and said, "Thank you." They stood on opposite sides of the kitchen for a moment in the comfortable quiet, and then he said, "Where were you headed?" She told him about the teaching position in Santa Fe, the correspondence, the letter of employment, the hope that underpinned it. She told it plainly, without the self-deprecating apologies she had been known to insert into her own story when she was around people who seemed to expect them. He listened without interrupting, which was rarer than it ought to have been in her experience, and when she was done he nodded. "Good work," he said. "Teaching." "I believe in it," she said, "though I'm aware that's perhaps an unusual thing to say." "No," he said. "It's not unusual, it's just not often said plainly." He turned back to whatever he was tending on the stove, eggs, she was astonished to discover, from chickens he apparently kept in a small coop behind the barn that she hadn't noticed in the dark. "What happened to your last position?" She hesitated. "The school in Tucson closed," she said. "Or rather, it was decided that it should close. There were differences of opinion about who should be admitted as students." He looked at her over his shoulder just briefly. "You taught everyone," he said. "It was not quite a question." "I tried to," she said. "The children of the Mexican families in the district, the Chinese children whose fathers worked the mines, they deserved the same education. Not everyone agreed." He turned back to the stove and said nothing for a moment, and then he said, "No, they didn't agree, I mean." He put the eggs on the table and sat down across from her and said, "I respect that you tried." She looked at him. "You're not going to tell me it was ill-advised." "I'm not going to tell you any such thing," he said. She picked up her fork, and there was something in her chest that had been tightly held for some months that loosened a fraction, like a boot that had been too tight and is allowed finally to breathe. She ate her eggs and drank her coffee and watched the sun come over the ridge, and Levi Bishop ate his eggs across the table and did not fill the silence with anything unnecessary, and it was one of the best breakfasts she had eaten in a long time. The relay station man came mid-morning with her trunk, miraculously mostly intact, and the news that Cole the driver was alive and in the care of the doctor at Selden Wells and had a fair chance of keeping the leg, which was the best news that could have been hoped for. DeVoe had hired a fresh stage north. Mrs. Caldera sent a message through the station man, a small folded note that said only, in neat Spanish that Violet could read, "God was looking out for us, and I think perhaps he used a roan horse." She read it and smiled at it and put it in her reticule. And then there was the question of what came next. The next stage north would not be for 2 days, which was how long it took for the regular schedule to come back around. The relay station had a room, and she had money enough for 2 nights, but she found herself looking at the road to the station, and then looking back at the homestead, and thinking about a series of things that she was not quite ready to examine individually. Levi was checking something on one of his horse's feet, crouched down with the hoof in his lap, and he said, without looking up, "You can stay here while you wait for the stage. The room is there. It's no trouble." She looked at the back of his bent head, his hat pushed forward, and she said, "I don't want to impose on you." "You're not imposing," he said, and put the horse's hoof down and straightened and looked at her. "But it's your choice." She stayed. The 2 days stretched into something that she would later understand had its own inevitable quality. The way rivers run downhill not because they choose to, but because that is the nature of water and hills. She asked him that afternoon if she could be useful, because sitting idle was not something she had any talent for, and he looked at her for a moment as though he were trying to judge whether she meant it. And when he decided she did, he handed her a list of things that needed doing in the kitchen garden, which had been suffering from a combination of his inattention and an assault by rabbits, and she spent 3 hours in the warm afternoon sun working her way through it with a satisfaction that surprised her. He came by once to check something at the water pump and found her arguing with a particularly stubborn knot of roots, and she heard him make a sound behind her that she identified after a moment as a suppressed laugh. She turned around. "Something amusing. You talked to them," he said. "To what?" "The roots." She looked at her hands, then back at him. They weren't cooperating. "And did the conversation help?" She looked at the root, which she had in fact just managed to free, and then back at him. "Yes," she said, with all the dignity she had available. He grinned then, a full, honest grin that rearranged his face entirely, and she discovered that she had been waiting for it without knowing she was waiting, and that it was worth the wait, and that this was perhaps information she ought to think carefully about. That evening he cooked a proper supper, not the improvised stew of the night before, but something more careful. A braised rabbit with what herbs he apparently kept drying in the kitchen and cornbread from a skillet, and they ate at the table across from each other in the lamplight, and the conversation found its own shape, the way conversation does between 2 people who have something to say to each other. He talked about the land, about the survey work he did in the summers for a railroad company that was trying to map possible routes through the territory, about why he had chosen this particular piece of ground. He had come out from Missouri at 22, he told her, after his father's farm was lost to debt, looking for land that was his own and not subject to anyone else's decisions about its fate. He had found this quarter section, filed the claim, built the house himself over 2 months living in the barn, and had been making it work since then. "You've been surveying for the railroad," she said, and there was a careful note in her voice that he caught. He looked at her steadily. "I know what the railroad means for this country," he said. "I know what it means for the people who have been here longer than anyone who came with a deed in their pocket. I'm not going to pretend otherwise." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "But they're going to survey whether I do it or not. And the survey I do it honestly. I write down what I see. I don't mark land as empty when it isn't." She looked at him. "And does that make a difference?" "Sometimes," he said. "Not always." "But sometimes," he paused. "I know that's not a satisfying answer." "It's an honest one," she said, "which I find more valuable." He looked at her again, that steady measuring look. And this time there was something in it that was warmer than measurement, something that she felt in a physical way that she chose not to examine too closely while sitting across a kitchen table from a man she had known for not quite a full day. She asked him about the books on the shelf, and this unlocked something in him that had been quiet, not shut away but resting, the way a spring rests underground. He talked about natural history with an enthusiasm that was entirely genuine and unguarded, about the formations of the canyon walls, about the way the territory's landscape had been shaped by forces that operated on a scale of time that made human concerns feel appropriately humble. He had corresponded, he told her, with a professor at the University of Missouri who had encouraged him to write down his observations, had told him that what he was seeing and recording from the field was genuinely valuable. She listened and asked questions, real questions, not the polite social questions of someone waiting for their turn to speak, but the questions of someone who was genuinely interested and wanted to know more. And he noticed the difference. She could see that he noticed it, in the way his posture changed, the way the careful guardedness of a man accustomed to solitude gradually released itself around her like something learning it was safe to breathe. On the second day she borrowed his hammer and nails. She had her sewing kit and her tools from her trunk now, and fixed the loose hinge on the door of the chicken coop, which had been allowing in something that had been frightening the chickens at night. And he came out to find it done and looked at her again with that look that was becoming familiar. "My father was a practical man," she said, before he could say anything. "He believed that a woman who couldn't fix a hinge was a woman with more help than sense." "He sounds like he was a good man," Levi said. "He was," she said. "He died 4 years ago, my mother 2 years before that." She said it simply, without asking for sympathy, but he heard what was underneath it, which was the truth of a person who had been navigating everything alone for years and had gotten very good at not letting that show. "I'm sorry," he said, and he said it in the way people say things they mean rather than the way they say things they're supposed to mean, and she found she could receive it without deflecting it, which was itself unusual. They stood in the morning light by the chicken coop, and the moment was one of those moments that asks something of the people in it, that has weight and shape and direction. "Where are you from originally?" he asked. "Virginia," she said. "Though I've been moving west for 5 years now, Kansas first, then Colorado, then Tucson." "What made you keep moving?" She thought about it. "Every time I thought I'd found the place," she said, "it turned out not to be, or it turned into something it wasn't supposed to be." She paused. "I keep thinking the right place is somewhere a little further." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Maybe it isn't further." She looked at him. "Maybe you just hadn't found it yet," he said. And he said it quietly, without pressure, not as an invitation so much as a possibility. And he didn't hold her gaze any longer than was natural, just looked away to the mountains the way he did when he said something he meant and didn't want a crowd with expectation. She went to the relay station that afternoon to confirm the stage schedule, And it was while she was standing at the station's rough counter, looking at the posted schedule, that she became aware she was doing a calculation she had not officially decided to do. She was calculating what was lost if she did not get on the stage. She was thinking about the school position, about the letter of employment, about the plans she had made and the correspondence she had sustained over months. She was thinking about $22 and a fresh start and what she had come west for. She was also thinking about a kitchen lit by lamplight, and a man who listened when she talked, and a kitchen garden that needed attention, and a shelf of books she hadn't finished looking at yet. She bought a paper at the station counter and read it on the walk back, and she was halfway to the track that led to his homestead before she quite registered that she had turned in that direction without making a formal decision about it. He was at the corral when she came back, working with one of his horses, a younger bay that was still nervous and required patience, and he was being patient with it, talking to it in a low voice while he worked a brush along its neck. He looked up when she came through the gate. She said, "The stage leaves at noon the day after tomorrow." "All right," he said. "I was thinking," she said, and stopped, because she was not entirely sure what she was going to say, which was unusual for her. He waited, still holding the brush, the bay shifting behind him. "I was thinking," she said again, "that I ought to write to Santa Fe and explain the delay. It would only be proper." "Probably," he said. She looked at him. "Would you have paper? I used my last sheet on a letter before Tucson." "I've got paper," he said, and then, after a moment, "The station man could probably take it north for you when the next post rider comes through." "Yes," she said, "that would work." They looked at each other, and there was an understanding between them that was not quite spoken, but was no less real for that. The kind of understanding that exists between two honest people who are both trying very hard not to reach for something before they are sure of it. She wrote the letter to Santa Fe that evening, and it was a careful letter that explained the stagecoach accident and asked for a 2-week extension before she took up her position. And she read it over when she was done and found it entirely truthful. On the third morning, he asked her if she wanted to ride out with him to check the east fence line, which needed some repair from a storm 2 weeks prior, and she said yes before she had entirely decided to, and he saddled the second horse, a quiet older mare he said was named Patience, and they rode out into the morning desert together. There is something that happens when two people ride out into open country together. The landscape makes honest people of everyone eventually. The sky was enormous, and the desert was alive in the morning in ways it kept private from anyone who slept through the early hours. The roadrunner that sprinted across ahead of them, the small bright flowers that appeared among the red rocks, the way the light moved across the canyon walls to the east like a slow revelation. She asked him about the survey work, and he talked about it, and she listened. And then he asked her about teaching, and she talked about it, about the particular thrill of the moment when something came alive behind a child's eyes, when you could see the exact instant that understanding arrived. He listened with the same full attention he gave to everything, and she thought that, whatever else was true of this man, he was paying attention to the world with both hands, and it showed. They reached the fence line, and he dismounted and worked, and she held the horses and handed him tools when he asked for them, and they worked together in the comfortable way of people who have figured out each other's rhythms without discussion. She asked him about the land in a way that showed she was genuinely curious, and he showed her things, the layer of different colored rock where the canyon wall had once been a seafloor, which she found astonishing, and a print in the soft earth near a dry wash that he identified as a black bear, and the remnant of what he thought was an ancient dwelling, some arrangement of stones in the cliff face that looked deliberate and was, he said, very old. She stood looking at the stones in the cliff face and felt the weight of time in them, of all the people who had stood in this territory before any of them, and felt something like the profound smallness that is sometimes also its own kind of comfort. "The survey notes I sent to the professor," Levi said beside her, looking at the same stones. He wrote back that there had been documentation of similar structures further north, in what's being called Cliff Palace formations. He thought this might be connected. He paused. I reported it on my survey as a site of historical significance. She looked at him. Will the railroad pay attention to that? The survey company wrote back and told me to stick to geographical features only, he said. And did you? No, he said. She smiled. He saw it, and the corner of his mouth moved in that almost smile, and they stood there looking at the old stones in the cliff face in the morning light, and neither of them moved away. On the ride back, she asked him about Missouri, about what he had left, and he told her about his father's farm and the drought years, and the creditors and the particular grief of watching something your family had built come apart in the hands of people who saw it only as an account. He told it without bitterness, or rather with the kind of bitterness that has been worked through to something cleaner on the other side. And then he said something that she turned over in her mind for the rest of the ride. When you've lost something you can't get back, you can either spend your life looking backward at it or you can put your face forward and build something new. The second one is harder, but it's the only one that makes any sense. She thought about Virginia. She thought about her parents' house, sold after her father died. She thought about the school in Kansas that had closed when the town dried up, and the school in Colorado that had closed when the funding ran out, and the school in Tucson where she had made enemies simply by doing what she believed was right. She thought about the letter in her reticule and the $22 and the tenure at the new school in Santa Fe. She thought about a kitchen garden and a shelf of books and a man who fixed fences and told the truth on his surveys and talked to horses the way she talked to roots. That evening after supper, while the fire burned low, Levi set down his coffee cup and looked at her across the table and said, in his quiet, direct way, "I know you've got a place waiting for you in Santa Fe." "I do," she said, "and I know you've been working toward it for a long time." "I have." He turned the cup in his hands. "I'm not asking you to give that up," he said. "That's not what I'm saying." He looked up at her. "I'm saying that I'd be a fool not to tell you what I think you already know. That the last 3 days have been the best 3 days I've had in longer than I want to calculate, and that I'd like the chance to have more of them." The firelight was warm and the desert was quiet outside, and she looked at him and felt the truth of what he'd said sitting in her chest like a lit coal. "You're a very honest man," she said. "I try to be," he said. She looked at the fire. She thought about the right place and about moving forward. She thought about what he had said on the ride about building something new being harder but making sense. She thought about how she had spoken of always looking for a place that was a little further, and what he had said in return, that maybe she just hadn't found it yet. "Santa Fe is 2 days' ride from here," she said slowly. "The school doesn't start for 6 weeks. They gave me the extension." He was very still across the table. 6 weeks is enough time," she said, "to know whether something that feels like it might be real actually is." "Yes," he said, "it is." She looked at him, and the quiet between them was warm and full, and nothing was left unspoken that needed speaking, and she said, "Then we have 6 weeks, Levi Bishop." "Yes, we do," he said. And this time he smiled, a full smile, the grin that rearranged his face, and she smiled back at him with nothing held in reserve. And the fire burned low and warm, and the desert night was very large and very quiet around the small lit house. And it was one of those moments that you recognize, even while you are inside them, as a beginning. The 6 weeks became something she had not allowed herself to hope for in years. They became ordinary and extraordinary at the same time, which is the particular alchemy of two people who are genuinely right for each other, finding it out day by day. She took the second bedroom and kept it tidy, and he never made anything of the propriety of the arrangement except to say once, with the directness that was becoming as familiar as the sound of the water pump in the morning, that he was aware it was unusual, and he didn't give a cent what the relay station man thought about it, but that he wanted her to know he respected her and that she was safe. And she said she knew that, and she did. She wrote to the school in Santa Fe once a week, keeping them informed, and she helped with the homestead in all the ways she was useful, and she was useful in many. She replanted the kitchen garden and reorganized the cellar, and helped him with the spring shearing of the 2 sheep he kept for wool, which was an experience she described afterward in a letter to no one in particular, because she had no one to send it to, a letter she kept in the back of her trunk. He brought her on another survey ride to the east, and she helped him map a section of the creek route, and he showed her how to read the surveying instrument, and she was quick at it, quicker than he expected, and he said so, and she didn't bother to tell him that she had never expected anything less of herself. They had their disagreements, which was inevitable between 2 people who both had opinions they were not afraid to hold. He thought that the railroad's expansion was, on balance, an unstoppable fact of progress that was better managed than resisted. She thought that managing it was insufficient, that the people being displaced deserved more than management. They argued about this across the supper table with a heat that was in some ways its own kind of intimacy, 2 people who respected each other enough to push back. They didn't resolve it, because it was not a thing that resolved, but they found their way to understanding why each held what they held, and that was better. She talked to him about the children she had taught in Tucson, about Miguel, whose father worked the copper mines and who had been the quickest student she had ever had, about Mei Lin, whose English had arrived over the course of a single winter like a whole language blooming. He listened with the same attention she was coming to rely on, and asked questions that showed he understood what she was telling him, and once said quietly, "It matters. What you did. I want you to know that I think it matters." She had been looking at something on the table when he said it, and she looked up at him and felt the words land in a place that had been emptier than she'd admitted for a long time. There were evenings when they sat on the low bench outside the door after supper and watched the stars come out, which in Arizona, away from any town, was a spectacle on the order of a religious experience. He knew the constellations and their stories and told them to her, and she found herself leaning gradually closer as the night deepened, and he found himself not moving away, and one evening she was aware that her shoulder was pressed against his arm and that his arm had shifted to accommodate her and that neither of them had made a production of it. It was on a Saturday, 3 weeks into her stay, that he kissed her. They had been checking the water level in the storage barrel behind the house, a practical domestic task, and she had said something that made him laugh, and he was looking at her with the laugh still in his face, and she was looking at him, and he said her name once quietly, like a question, and she said yes to the question even though it hadn't been asked in words yet, and he kissed her with the same directness and honesty with which he did everything, not tentative but not rough. Careful in the way of someone who understood the weight of what they were doing. She kissed him back with everything she had, which was considerable. When they separated, the afternoon sun was on the yard, and the horses were making their evening sounds, and somewhere a quail was calling, and she looked at him and felt the thing in her chest that had been slowly warming for 3 weeks reach some kind of equilibrium, like something that had found its temperature and settled there. "I've been wanting to do that," he said, "since you waved your arms at me in the road." She laughed, a real laugh, the kind that takes over entirely. "I was a sight," she said. "Yes," he said, "you were." She looked at him. "That's not a denial." "No," he said, "it isn't." And he was smiling at her with that full grin that she had decided weeks ago was one of the finest things she had seen in the Arizona territory, and she thought about movement and about stillness and about the right place, and she leaned up and kissed him again briefly and then pulled back and said, "I still have to go to Santa Fe." "I know," he said. "I made a commitment," she said. "I know you did," he said, "and I'm not asking you to break it." He paused, and she could see him formulating the thing he wanted to say with the care he gave to things that mattered. "I'm asking if I can ride to Santa Fe with you." She looked at him. Her heart was doing something loud. "And then," he said, "whether you might consider, if the school works out and you're inclined, coming back out this way for a spell, and if you were inclined, maybe staying." He cleared his throat, which was the closest she had seen him come to uncertainty. "The territory needs teachers, and there are children within 15 miles of here who have none." She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the mountains, which were turning their evening purple, and at the kitchen garden, and at the chicken coop with its repaired hinge, and at the shelf of books through the window she could just see from where they stood. "There are children 15 miles from here who have no teacher," she said. "Mexican homesteaders to the south," he said, "a Navajo family to the northeast, and a group of settlers who came out from Illinois last year with 6 children between them and no schoolhouse." "You've been thinking about this for some time," she said. "Since about the second day," he said. She looked at him directly. She said, "Levi Bishop, are you asking me to marry you or to teach school near your homestead, or both?" He looked at her with those gray eyes, fully steady, fully honest. "Both," he said. "In whichever order makes sense to you." She was quiet for a long moment, which he bore with patience, and then she said, "You know very little about me in the larger sense. A few weeks." "I know enough," he said. "I know how you talk to roots and how you fix hinges and how you argue at supper about things that matter. I know that you'd lose a job before you'd exclude a child from learning. I know how you look at the stars." He paused. "I know I've been more alive in the last 3 weeks than in 4 years on this land alone." She felt the sting of something in her eyes that she blinked back, not from sadness but from the opposite thing, from the particular shock of being fully seen, which she had not expected and which was almost too large to look at directly. "I'll go to Santa Fe," she said carefully. "And I'll take up the position because I promised and because it matters and because I don't break promises." She looked at him. "But I've been writing 1 letter a week to a school in Santa Fe and thinking about this homestead every single day, and that tells me something about what I want." He waited. "Come to Santa Fe with me," she said. "Let's see what it looks like from there." "All right," he said. "And," she said, "the children 15 miles from here need a school." "They do," he said. "That's a project," she said. "It would be a big one," he said. She looked at the mountains. "I like a big project," she said. He smiled, and she smiled at him, and the quail was still calling somewhere in the evening, and the whole enormous territory was going purple and gold around them. And it was one of those moments where the future is visible for just a second, not as a finished thing but as a direction, warm and clear and entirely possible. He packed his saddlebags in the morning and made arrangements with the relay station man to keep an eye on the stock, which the station man agreed to in exchange for use of the south pasture for his own horses. They left 2 mornings later, riding north, and the road stretched ahead of them in the early light, and the desert was beautiful in the way it was always beautiful when you had someone beside you to see it. The ride to Santa Fe took 3 days, with stops at relay stations where no one knew them, which suited Violet well because she was not in the habit of explaining herself to strangers, and Levi was, if anything, even less so. They rode and they talked, and the conversation never ran out, which she had begun to believe was one of the better indicators of anything that mattered. They talked about Missouri and Virginia, and about the land, and about what they both thought the West was becoming, and whether that was what it should be. She told him things she had not told anyone in years, about the loneliness of the years after her parents died, about the particular specific loneliness of being a woman alone who was also competent, the way it frightened people. He listened without flinching, and without offering the sort of soothing dismissals that well-meaning people sometimes used in place of actually hearing something. He told her about the Army years, in more detail than before. 3 years in the Southwest, mostly as a surveyor attached to an infantry unit. He had seen things he did not choose to describe and had made a decision, at the end of his service, that the direction the Army was pursuing in the territory was not one he could be part of. He had said it simply, and she had heard the weight in the simplicity, and she thought about his survey notes and his refusal to mark land as empty when it wasn't, and understood that this was not a man who had drifted to his principles, but one who had arrived at them through deliberate and costly navigation. They arrived in Santa Fe on a Thursday afternoon, and the city, which was a city in the territorial sense, adobe and dust, and the meeting of very old and very new, received them without ceremony. He found a room at a boarding house that was decent and inexpensive, and she made her way to the school building, which was new timber construction at the edge of town, and met the committee of parents and community members who had established it, and they walked her through the building and told her about the students and discussed the schedule, and she listened to all of it and asked the questions a serious person asks. The school was real. The need was real. 31 children, ages 6 through 14, spread across a territory that had been making do without formal education for too long. She felt the pull of it, the genuine pull, the thing that had kept her teaching through every closed school and every hostile board and every discouraged morning when she had wondered whether it was worth it. It was worth it. It had always been worth it. She had supper with Levi at a table in the boarding house's dining room that evening, and she told him what she had seen, and he listened, and when she was done he said, "It's a good school." "It is," she said. "And you want to do it," he said. "I do," she said. He nodded. "Then do it." She looked at him. "You came all this way with me." "Yes," he said. "And you'll ride back alone." He looked at her steadily. "I didn't say that." He turned his cup in his hands. "I have survey work in the north of the territory this summer. I can base myself in Santa Fe as easily as not. It's not so different from what I'd planned, just in a different direction." He looked up. "And at the end of the summer, if you're amenable, there's a question I asked you at a water barrel in Arizona that I intend to ask again properly." She felt the warmth of it, steady and real, and she said, "You're going to make me wait until the end of the summer." He looked at her, and there was something warm and certain in his face. "No," he said, "I don't think I am." He reached into the breast pocket of his coat and put something on the table between them, not a box, not a jeweler's case, but a small ring that was clearly old, plain silver with a small green stone that she thought might be turquoise. He said, "This was my mother's. It's not much, but it was hers, and I'd like it to be yours if you'll have it." She looked at the ring on the table between them and then at him, and she said, "Levi." "I know it's fast," he said. "It isn't," she said. "I've known you 3 weeks, and I know more about you than I knew about some people after 3 years." She picked up the ring. The turquoise was the color of the Arizona sky in the morning. She turned it in her fingers. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath as though he had been holding it more than he had let on, and she smiled at him for it, at the evidence that the careful stillness had been costing him something, and she reached across the table and took his hand and put the ring on her own finger and looked at it there. "June," she said, "after the school term is well established. You'll have your summer survey done by then, won't you?" "I can arrange it," he said. "Then June," she said, and squeezed his hand. The following months were the fullest she had known in a long time. She threw herself into the school with everything she had. The 31 children were wild and curious and eager and difficult in turns, as all children are, and she loved them for all of it. She established a routine and a curriculum, and a library from donated and borrowed books, and she wrote letters to whoever she thought might donate more, and she received enough responses to fill a second shelf. She taught reading and arithmetic and geography and what she called natural history, using Levi's surveying notes for some of the geography lessons, which delighted her in a way she couldn't entirely explain. He was in Santa Fe through May, the survey work keeping him in the northern reaches of the territory. But he was back in the city regularly enough that they had suppers and walks and long evenings on the boarding house porch, where the Santa Fe air came off the mountains cool and clean, and they talked and argued and laughed and were wholly themselves with each other in the way that good love allows. He brought her a piece of canyon rock from his survey work, a piece that showed the layers in cross-section in a way that was visually extraordinary. A record of 300 million years in a piece of stone that fit in her palm. She put it on the schoolroom's nature shelf, where it prompted more questions from the children than almost anything else she taught that semester. He met several of her students on an afternoon when he came to the school while she was still teaching, and she watched him with them from across the room, watched him crouch down to talk to a 7-year-old named Rosario at eye level, and answer the child's question about horses with complete seriousness. And she thought that the heart does not need much time to be certain when it is paying proper attention. The June wedding was simple in the way of people who have what they need and don't require the rest of it. They were married by the alcalde on a Saturday afternoon in the plaza, with the school committee as witnesses and 2 families of her students in attendance, because the children had asked to come, and she had not been able to say no. She wore her best dress, which was green calico and well pressed, and he wore his good coat, which he had clearly cleaned and brushed, and there were wildflowers from somewhere that one of the children had brought in a jar, and the afternoon light in Santa Fe in June is a color that has no precise name and is simply beautiful. He put the ring, the turquoise ring that had been his mother's, on her finger again in ceremony, and she took his hand and meant every word she said with the entirety of herself. She continued to teach through the summer, because the school ran on a year-round schedule to accommodate the farming family's needs. He continued to survey, and came back to Santa Fe each time as though it were home, which it was becoming for both of them. He filed one survey report that autumn that included a formal notation about several sites of historical significance in the territory north of Santa Fe, and sent a copy to the professor in Missouri, and received back a letter that said the documentation was invaluable, and that the professor was in correspondence with someone at the Smithsonian Institution about it. In October, the school received a donation of 24 books from a charitable organization in Boston that had been corresponding with Violet since August. She spent an entire Saturday organizing them with 3 of her older students who were by now as invested in the school's library as she was, and she came home that evening dusty and happy and was met at the boarding house. They had taken a small house by then, 2 rooms and a kitchen and a yard, by the smell of supper cooking, which was becoming one of the great regularities of her life and showed no signs of diminishing. She found him at the stove, and she leaned against the kitchen door watching him for a moment before he heard her, and she thought about all the places she had been and all the wrong places that had not been right, and she thought about a stagecoach and a road and a man on a roan horse who had come from the direction of ahead, and she thought, here is the place. Here is the person, not a little further, right here. She came into the kitchen and he turned and saw her face and she kissed him by the stove. By the following spring she was expecting their first child, which she told him on a March morning over coffee in the kitchen, saying it simply and directly the way she said things that mattered, and watching his face move through several things in quick succession: surprise, and then a joy that was the real kind, not the performed kind, that arrived in his eyes before he had time to compose it. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and held her, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and felt all right about everything, which was not a small thing. They wrote to Missouri together, to a cousin of his who was the only family either of them had left, and received back a letter that was warm and congratulatory and full of questions about the territory. In the summer of 1879, with Violet 7 months along and as stubbornly active as she had ever been, Levi found a buyer for a portion of the Arizona homestead's southern acres, not the homestead itself, which he retained, but enough land to fund a project they had been planning since their first weeks together. He rode down to the Arizona homestead to finalize the arrangements and returned to Santa Fe with the money, and in September, with 6 weeks of school term completed and the summer heat finally breaking, they made the ride back to Arizona together. The homestead was as she remembered it, perhaps more cared for than when she had first seen it, the kitchen garden overrun but easily reclaimed, the barn solid, the water pump faithful. The relay station man had kept his word about the horses. And the land to the south and northeast, where Levi had described the Mexican homesteaders and the Navajo family and the Illinois settlers with their 6 children, was still there, still waiting. She stood in the yard the morning after their arrival and looked out at the desert and thought about what they had talked about, the project, the need, the schoolhouse. She had an entire summer's worth of teaching experience, a network of donors, a crate of books that had traveled by stage from Santa Fe, and a husband who knew how to build things. He came to stand beside her, 2 cups of coffee, and followed her gaze. "Ready," he said. "I've been ready since June of last year," she said. He laughed and handed her the coffee, and that afternoon they rode out together to the Mexican homesteaders to the south, to a family named Fuentes who had 5 children and a wide, dry farm, and a welcome that was offered cautiously at first and then openly. And she sat at their table and talked about the school she intended to build, and what she needed from the community and what she could offer. And she watched caution become interest and interest become something warmer. And Levi sat beside her and was steady and translated where her Spanish failed her, and she translated where his failed him. And by the time they left, the Fuentes family had offered lumber they had been saving for a barn. Extension. The baby arrived in November, 3 weeks early and in considerable hurry, the way the Bishop children, as she would later discover, were constitutionally inclined to arrive. It was a boy, and he was healthy and loud and had gray eyes from the moment they could be determined, and they named him Thomas, which had been Levi's father's name, and James, for a reason that was private and belonged to Violet, and called him Tom because it suited him from the first day. The schoolhouse was built in December, a collaborative effort that involved the Fuentes family's lumber and the Illinois settlers' labor, and a donation of windows from the trading post in Selden Wells that Violet had written to 3 times. It was a single room, adobe walls and timber roof and a plank floor, but it had good windows and a good stove and a shelf for books along the back wall. She hung a map of the United States territory on one wall, which the children stared at with a wonder that she never tired of watching. She opened the school in January of 1880, with 14 students on the first day, ranging in age from 6 to 13, speaking among them English, Spanish, and Navajo, which presented challenges she found more interesting than discouraging. She had by then enough experience and enough stubbornness to meet those challenges one at a time, which is the only reasonable way to meet them. Levi, for his part, was not idle. He expanded the homestead, added a 2nd bedroom and then a 3rd, and wrote his survey notes into a longer document that the professor in Missouri eventually helped him submit to a geographic journal, where it was published in the spring of 1880 under both their names, because she had contributed substantially to the written sections, and he was not a man who forgot that or pretended otherwise. There was a day in that spring when she came in from the schoolhouse, which was only half a mile from the homestead now, close enough to walk, to find him on the floor of the main room with Tom, who was 4 months old and regarding the ceiling with the profound seriousness of a person encountering the universe for the first time. Levi was lying on his back beside the baby, looking at the same ceiling, and narrating something to him in a low voice. She stood in the doorway and listened, and found that he was describing the geological formation visible in the canyon wall to the east, from memory, in the tone of voice that he used when he was talking about something he found genuinely beautiful. She put down her things and sat beside them on the floor, and Levi looked over at her, and Tom looked over at her, and she took the baby's small hand in hers and leaned back against Levi's shoulder, and looked at the ceiling that seemed to be the afternoon's point of general interest, and thought that this exact, remarkable thing, was the thing she had been looking for when she boarded all those stagecoaches in all those places. The relay station man's wife, a woman named Gloria Renfrew who had arrived in the territory the previous year from Texas, came to call in the late spring, and she and Violet formed the kind of friendship that takes hold quickly and completely because both people in it know their own minds. Gloria was practical and funny, and had opinions she wasn't shy about, and she began bringing her 2 older children to the school the following term, which brought the enrollment to 16. In the summer of 1880, a rider came from the south, with a letter for Violet that was from the original school committee in Santa Fe, informing her that the teacher they had hired after she had written to explain her change of plans had decided to move on after 1 year, and asking whether she knew of any qualified candidates. She wrote back recommending a young woman she had met in Santa Fe who was capable and earnest and needed the position, and the committee hired that young woman, and Violet received a letter 3 months later saying the school was doing well, which gave her a satisfaction that belonged to the kind of pride that has nothing to do with oneself and everything to do with what you've helped build. In the autumn of 1880, she stood at the front of her small schoolhouse and looked out at the 16 children arranged on the benches in the morning light, Rosario Fuentes reading to herself in the front row, the 2 Navajo brothers in the third row bent together over a map, the well-end children from Illinois who had arrived knowing nothing and were now the most competitive readers in the room, and felt the thing she always felt in that moment, which was that this was worth it, all of it. Every closed school and wrong place, and difficult morning and lonely year. She told him that evening, in the way she had come to tell him things, plainly and directly across the supper table, and he listened with his full attention, and then he said, "I know," and meant it, and reached across the table and took her hand. She was expecting their second child by that winter, which she told him the same way she had told him the first time, over morning coffee, and he crossed the kitchen the same way he had crossed it before, which she had been waiting for since she realized she was expecting, because some things are worth anticipating. The second child was a girl, born in August of 1881, healthy and full-voiced and ferociously interested in everything from her first weeks, which her mother found entirely appropriate. They named her Clara Frances and called her Clara, and Tom regarded her from the beginning with the solemn interest of a child who has had the world to himself and is now receiving a collaborator. The homestead by then was genuinely a home, in the way that homes are made rather than found, layer by layer through the accumulation of ordinary and extraordinary days, through arguments and repairs and meals and growing things, and the way light falls on familiar walls at different hours. The third bedroom was Tom's, and the house felt full in the way that good houses feel full, not crowded but inhabited. In 1882, a dispute arose in the territory about land rights for the Mexican homesteaders to the south, about a claim being made by a land speculator from back east who had found a way to challenge the original deeds. Levi spent 3 weeks of that spring in correspondence with a lawyer in Albuquerque, and making 2 trips south to meet with the Fuentes family and 2 others who were affected. He documented everything with the same care he brought to his survey work, and the case was presented clearly enough that the speculator's challenge did not succeed, which was not guaranteed and not typical, and Violet knew the hours he had spent on it and what it had cost him in survey work time and said so. He said, "It matters," which was what she had said about her teaching once, and he had remembered it. She kissed him for that thoroughly. The school enrollment reached 22 in the spring of 1882, which was more than one room could comfortably hold, and Violet wrote to the Trading Post and the Territorial Education Committee and the Boston Charitable Organization and anyone else who had ever donated anything, and by autumn there was a second room added, which made the school a proper 2-room schoolhouse that she was inordinately proud of. Gloria Renfrew, who had discovered a talent for arithmetic instruction that neither of them had predicted, began helping part-time, which freed Violet to take the older students more seriously in geography and reading comprehension. On a November evening in 1882, they sat outside on the low bench after supper, as they still did when the weather allowed, the children asleep inside, the desert enormous and quiet around them. The stars were out in their full Arizona abundance, the way they had been on those evenings in the beginning, when she was still sleeping in the second bedroom and telling herself she would be on the next stage north. She leaned against him, his arm around her, and she said, "Do you remember what you said on the road?" "When you first came up," he thought, "I said, 'How bad is it?'" "Yes," she said, That was the first thing you said to me. In my defense, he said, there was a stagecoach in a ravine. She laughed. There was. She looked at the stars. I was thinking about what I must have looked like standing in the middle of the road. I've told you what you looked like, he said. You said I was a sight. You were, he said. You were also the most certain person I'd ever seen standing in the middle of a road in the middle of the desert with blood on your face, waving your arms, as if the horse was going to argue with you. She was quiet for a moment. I was terrified, she said. I know, he said. That's what I mean. You were terrified and you stood in the road anyway. She turned her face up to look at him in the starlight, this face she knew now in every light and every mood, and she thought about all the stages she had boarded and all the places she had tried, and the road that had given way and the ravine and the hawk circling and the roan horse coming from the direction of ahead. I'm glad that road gave way, she said. He looked at her, and his eyes were warm and steady. So am I, he said. She turned back to the stars, and he held her, and the desert was quiet with its enormous ancient quiet. And in the third bedroom Tom was dreaming something, and Clara was breathing in the small, steady rhythm that was one of the best sounds in the world, and the kitchen garden was sleeping, and the chickens were settled, and the schoolhouse half a mile away was dark and waiting for morning. She thought about the stone on the nature shelf, the one that showed 300 million years in a piece you could hold in your palm, and she thought about how small any single life was against that measure, and how that smallness was not diminishment but perspective, and how perspective was everything. She thought about a stagecoach window and a rocky slope and 2 words across a ruined road, Levi Bishop. He was the anywhere, she thought. Not a location, not a destination, a person. The place she had been moving toward without knowing it, across every wrong place and every closed door, across Virginia and Kansas and Colorado and Tucson, and the road 3 miles from everywhere. The stars continued their enormous turning, and the night settled around the small lit house, and Violet Norris Bishop, who had been thrown from a stagecoach and landed in the middle of her own life, leaned against her husband's shoulder and closed her eyes, and the desert was quiet, and she was home. The morning of the following day came up gold and clear, and Tom was awake before either of them, which was always the case, and Clara was making the imperious small sounds that meant she expected to be attended to immediately, which was also always the case. Violet got up and fed the baby, and Levi got up and started the fire, and Tom came into the kitchen and sat at the table and looked at them both with those gray eyes that saw everything, and asked what was for breakfast. Eggs, said Levi. There's cornbread from yesterday, said Violet. Tom considered this seriously, as though it were a decision requiring deliberation, and then nodded. She stood at the kitchen window with Clara warm against her shoulder, and watched the sun come over the ridge, the same light, and thought about whether she would teach them, Tom and Clara and whoever else might come, about the layers in the canyon wall and the old stones in the cliff face and the meaning of a hawk circling in a narrow strip of sky. She would, she decided. All of it. Every bit of it. The way roots require patience and direct conversation. The way a survey can be honest even when the world prefers a useful lie. The way a ring with a turquoise stone, the color of morning sky, can cross a generation and mean everything it was meant to mean. The way a road that gives way can be the exact right thing. She kissed her daughter's head and looked at her husband over Clara's dark, soft hair, and he looked back at her across the kitchen and said nothing because nothing needed saying, and the morning was entirely full and the day was ahead of them. And the schoolhouse was waiting half a mile away with 22 children who were going to arrive at 8 o'clock and want to be taught. And the canyon was out there with its 300 million years of patient record. And the desert was red and gold in the early light. And the hawk was circling again, or perhaps it was a different hawk. It was hard to tell from this distance. It didn't matter. What mattered was the fire on the stove and the sound of Tom explaining something to himself at the table with considerable seriousness, and the weight of the baby and the smell of cornbread, and the man across the room who had come from the direction of a head on a roan horse and had not, in all the years since, given her any reason to wish he had come from any other direction at all. She thought, this is it. This is what it was supposed to be. And she was entirely right.